The courtroom fell into a breathless silence. Not the usual respectful quiet that fills the Supreme Court. Chamber this was different, heavier, like the air itself had stopped moving. No one spoke. No one dared blink. It was the kind of moment where even the sound of a pen hitting the floor would feel too loud. Something had just happened, something that wasn't supposed to happen in this place of tradition, rules, and order. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, one of the most respected voices on the bench, had just cut off a sitting Congresswoman mid-argument. That Congresswoman was Jasmine Crockett. And what she said back didn't just catch Sotomayor off guard, froze the entire room. Some people gasped. A few looked down, unsure if they'd just witnessed brilliance or something dangerous. But everyone knew this wasn't politics as usual. This wasn't a speech. This was a direct hit on the very idea of who gets to speak in America's highest court. On one side was Sotomayor, giant in the legal world. A woman who had spent decades rising through the ranks, known for her sharp questions and unshakable authority. On the other side was Crockett's younger voice, unafraid, fierce, and unfiltered. A former public defender turned lawmaker who'd made a name for herself not by following rules, but by challenging them. This wasn't just about law. It was about voice, about power, about whether real-life stories deserve a place in legal arguments. Everyone in that courtroom felt that this was a moment that would echo far beyond those marble walls. Reporters scribbled faster. The Chief Justice looked tense. Even veteran court staff held their breath. What Jasmine Crockett said next wouldn't just shake the room. It would shake the country. The Supreme Court chamber was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled with law students in sharp suits, reporters with notebooks ready, constitutional scholars whispering quietly, and a few dignitaries trying to hide their curiosity behind neutral faces. Some had lined up hours before dawn to be here. Not just because it was a big case, but because something rare was happening today. A sitting Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had been given the green light to stand before the 9 justices and present oral arguments. It was almost unheard of, and the case she was here for. It could change how America draws its voting maps for a generation. The stakes were sky high. If the court ruled against her side, states could redraw congressional districts in ways that might push entire communities out of the conversation, especially minority and low-income ones. If they ruled in favor, it could tighten protections around voting rights that had been slipping for years. Now, this wasn't a technical debate about lines on a map. It was about who gets heard in a democracy. Sitting at the far left end of the bench was Justice Sonia Sotomayor. 70 years old, sharp, respected, feared. The first Latina on the court and one of its strongest progressive voices. For years, she had written powerful dissents on voting rights, police power, immigration. She had carved her place in history through fierce logic and even fiercer questioning. She didn't suffer weak arguments, and she didn't tolerate courtroom showmanship. Across from her stood Jasmine Crockett, 43, confident, and completely at ease with a microphone or a courtroom. She wasn't a stranger to pressure. She had built her career as a public defender, fighting for people who couldn't afford to fight back. She was loud when she needed to be, sharp when it counted, and completely unapologetic about who she represented. She didn't come from elite universities, but her voice had carried into millions of homes through social media. Today, she didn't look like she was here to ask for permission. She looked like she was here to prove a point. The moment Crockett began to speak, the mood shifted. Her voice was clear, steady, but full of something more fire. She didn't open with legal theory. She opened with a name, then another, then a short story. A grandmother who had voted in every election for 40 years, now removed from the rolls. A college student turned away because her district had suddenly changed. These were real people, she said. Not numbers, not legal tests. People. Didn't take long for the interruption. Justice Sotomayor's voice cut through like a knife. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, leaning forward slightly, "this court deals in law, not political storytelling." The room tensed. You could feel it, like a string pulled tight. Everyone expected friction, but not like this, not from Sotomayor. She was supposed to be the ally in this fight, but now it sounded like a warning. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't roll her eyes. She simply paused, then answered not with anger, but with calm precision. She mentioned Brown v. Board of Education, the story of a girl whose walk to school helped end segregation. She brought up Gideon v. Wainwright, a man's letter to the court that changed the right to a fair trial. These weren't just legal arguments, she said. They were stories. They were lives. The reporters in the gallery typed faster. Some of the justices shifted in their seats. This was no longer a typical hearing. It was a collision, not just of opinions, but of worlds. And then Crockett turned toward Justice Sotomayor, not aggressively, but directly. "Your Honor," she said, "during your confirmation hearing, you told stories. You spoke about growing up in the Bronx, about your mother's sacrifice, about your health struggles. You used those experiences to explain how they shaped your view of justice." She paused. "So tell me, why do your stories matter, but my constituents don't?" Gasps weren't loud, but they were real. A few people in the gallery blinked hard, as if trying to catch up to what had just been said. Others just stared. Sotomayor didn't answer. Not right away. Her jaw tightened, and her pen tapped once, just once against the bench. The kind of small, automatic movement that meant she was trying to stay composed. Inside the chamber, the division grew. Some thought Crockett had crossed a line. Others saw bravery. A congresswoman standing in front of the highest court in the country, not backing down, not playing by unspoken rules. The tension was sharp now. Not just between two women, but between two ideas. Whether law should stay above the mess of real life, or whether real life should finally break through. And they weren't done yet. The air inside the chamber didn't just feel tense, felt heavy, like something invisible had pressed down on the room, forcing everyone to hold still. Justice Sotomayor's sharp words still lingered in the silence, but all eyes had turned to one person. Jasmine Crockett stood tall behind the podium, not shaken, not searching for words. Her shoulders were square, her eyes steady. She wasn't waiting for permission. She was ready to speak, and everyone knew whatever came next would be remembered. Without rushing, Crockett reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and pulled out a small folded card. She opened it slowly, placed it on the podium, and began to read, not for the court, but for the people who sent her here. "I do solemnly swear," she said, her voice firm, "that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic." She looked up. Her voice didn't shake, even the ones who tried to silence. The people, you could feel it. The oxygen seemed to vanish from the room for just a second. "I'm not just a lawyer arguing a case," she said. "I'm a representative of 760,000 Americans. They may never set foot in this courtroom, but their lives are affected by every ruling made in it. And when you tell me their stories don't belong here, you're not just silencing me, you're silencing them." Justice Sotomayor sat still, but the shift in her expression was clear. Her sharp authority softened not with defeat, but with something else. Reflection. This wasn't just pushback. It was a mirror being held up. Crockett leaned forward slightly, not to challenge, but to clarify. If real-world impact doesn't belong in this courtroom, then what are we doing here? If law doesn't connect to people's lives, then it's just words on paper. Theory with no heartbeat. She turned and looked directly at the mural of Chief Justice John Marshall, high above the chamber. He didn't create judicial review so 9 people could sit above the rest of the country. He created it to protect the people from power that forgets who it serves. You could hear pens stop moving. Reporters, stunned. Legal scholars, wide-eyed. Even Justice Clarence Thomas, who had barely shifted during the entire session, looked up from his notes. Something was happening that didn't happen in these halls. This wasn't just legal argument. This was history forming in real time. Justice Sotomayor finally spoke again, but this time her voice didn't carry the edge it had earlier. It was softer, slower perhaps, she said. We must consider how individual stories inform constitutional interpretation. She didn't say more. She didn't need to. The meaning was clear. Something had gotten through, but Crockett wasn't finished. This court, she said, can't keep making decisions based only on papers written in perfect grammar by people with Ivy League degrees, because that's not who this country is. The people I speak for, they don't quote court cases. They quote rent prices, grocery bills, bus schedules, voting lines. She paused just long enough to let it sit. When you say their stories don't belong in this space, you make this court smaller. You disconnect it from the people it's meant to serve. A few heads in the gallery nodded quietly. One woman covered her mouth, holding back emotion. The courtroom had changed. This was no longer about district lines or legal standing. It was about voice. It was about who counts. Then Crockett turned her gaze back to the bench. You, Justice Sotomayor, have spoken about your journey. From the Bronx to this bench. You've told young people that their story matters, that where they come from can shape where they're going. She looked right at her, not defiant, just honest. Isn't that the very idea we're debating right now? That stories like yours and mine don't weaken the law, they give it meaning. For a moment, the judge didn't respond. She simply stared. And then, slowly, she gave the smallest nod. Not approval, not agreement, but recognition. Like she had just seen something she hadn't expected but needed to. All across the chamber, people were still. Not out of fear, but out of respect for what they were witnessing. The justices weren't just hearing an argument. They were being asked to listen in a new way. This wasn't just a court session anymore. 'Twas a shift. A moment when the wall between power and people cracked just enough for a voice to come through. A voice that wouldn't be ignored. A moment that said, law is not untouchable. It is alive, and it should listen. The moment the Chief Justice brought down the gavel and closed the session. The room that had been silent for so long exploded into quiet chaos. Reporters rushed out of the chamber, their fingers already tapping furiously on phones and laptops. Camera crews outside scrambled to go live. The story wasn't just big, was massive. And it had unfolded live, in front of the highest court. In the land, within minutes, social media lit up. Hashtags like #CrockettVSCourt and #VoicesMatter spread faster than anyone expected. Clips of the moment when Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood her ground were everywhere on TikTok, on cable news, on student group chats. It didn't matter if you were a law expert or someone who had never watched a court session before you. Felt it. Something real had happened. Progressive leaders were quick to speak up. Some called it the most important courtroom moment of the decade. Young activists said it gave them hope. Even a few conservative voices who disagreed with Crockett's politics admitted she had shown boldness and control that couldn't be ignored. One commentator simply said, she walked into the lion's den and didn't blink. Across the country, the debate took off. Newsrooms, college classes, podcasts, even high school civics teachers asked the same question. Should personal stories have a place in the courtroom? Law schools added what they began calling the Crockett Exchange to their lecture slides. The clip of her saying, "You can't serve people you refuse to hear," was played over and over again. Within a few weeks, Crockett and Justice Sotomayor had a private meeting at a judicial conference. No cameras, no microphones, just the two of them in a quiet room. A source close to the meeting said Sotomayor told her something simple but powerful. "You challenged me to be better." It wasn't an apology. Didn't need to be. It was a sign of respect between two women who had stood their ground and still found space to grow. This was never about shouting someone down. It wasn't a stunt. It was a reminder, raw and honest, of what democracy looks like when it's pushed to be more than just tradition. Crockett didn't try to destroy the institution. She asked it to listen. And in that ask, something changed. Posters with her quote started showing up at protests. Students printed it on shirts. A teacher in Georgia painted it on a classroom wall. "You can't serve people you refuse to hear." Simple, direct, true. And maybe that's what this whole moment will be remembered for. Not just the clash, not just the courage, but the way it reminded everyone watching that democracy isn't always clean, but it should always be loud enough to hear the people who live with its choices in a system built on checks and balances. Maybe the loudest check isn't written in a book or shouted from a bench. Maybe the loudest check is the one spoken for those who aren't usually invited into the room, the voiceless. And that's the voice Jasmine Crockett carried with her into that courtroom and refused to leave behind.